such a pleasure to see you all filling the room. And this afternoon or this evening, I don't know what it is for you. It's such an honor to have Katherena Vermette with us today. So I wish to welcome you to our university, the University of Salamanca, for this symposium about the agency of narrative. Thank you also for accepting this invitation and crossing half the continent and the Atlantic Ocean to join us during a couple of days. And I hope that the jet lag is not too harsh on you and you can enjoy your stay among us. To many of you here this evening, Winnipeg-based Métis writer Katherena Vermette does not need an introduction, as you've become familiar with her work in the context of the undergraduate course Globalization and Diaspora in English Literatures. But nevertheless, an abridged account of her academic and literary merits may include the following details. Vermette self-identifies as a Michif, that is Red River, Métis writer from Treaty 1 territory, the heart of the Métis Nation in Winnipeg, Manitoba, Canada. Her Michif roots can be traced, can be traced on her paternal side in St. Boniface and beyond. Her maternal side is Mennonite, from Treaty 1 area too. She is a transgenre writer, I would say, who has published to date 2 books of poetry, 3 novels, a graphic novel, and 8 children's books. She has also co-directed with Erica McPherson the 20-minute National Film Board of Canada documentary, This River, about Indigenous families who drag the Red River for family members who have disappeared. In the film, Katherena Vermette speaks about the experience of losing her older brother. In this film, you see the tragedy that spreads over the community and affects a whole people, I would say, right? Everyone. So This River won the Canadian Screen Award for Best Short Documentary in 2017. Her first book, Northern Love Songs, won the Governor General's Literary Award for Poetry in 2013. The novels The Break, The Strangers, and The Circle, which can be read as a trilogy or as standalone novels, were all national bestsellers. The Break won the Amazon Canada First Novel Award in 2017. Its French translation, Ligne Brisée, won the 2018 competition of Les Combats des Livres. The Strangers was the winner of the 2021 Atwood Gibson Writers' Trust Fiction Prize and was named among the year's best Canadian fiction by CBC Books. I understand that your 4th novel may be titled Real Ones. Yeah. Will be released this coming fall. Yeah. So we are looking forward to that. Vermette's work, and I keep clicking the wrong button. Vermette's work for children consists of the series of children's stories, the 7 teaching stories, based on Anishinaabe's 7 sacred teachings, including wisdom, humility, love, respect, courage, honesty, and truth. And also the picture book, The Girl and the Wolf, illustrated by award-winning Métis artist Julie Flett. She has also published a graphic novel series for young adults titled A Girl Called Echo, consisting thus far of 4 volumes. Pemmican Wars, Red River Resistance, Northwest Resistance, and Road Allowance Resistance, which is about the history of the Métis, right? Yeah. And finally, she holds a Master of Fine Arts from the University of British Columbia and an honorary doctor in letters from the University of Manitoba. So please, let's welcome Katherena Vermette with a round of applause. Thank you. Thank you. Now, since I believe in the relevance of situationality, if we can call it that, as a basis for understanding, for respect, for connection between 2 parties. And this is a practice that is also central to many indigenous protocols. Let me please say a few words about this university that welcomes you so warmly today, and which prides itself on being one of the earliest higher education institutions in Europe. It was founded over 800 years ago, in 1218, and it has played a major role in shaping modern thought and the world as we know it. In particular, the University of Salamanca has played a relevant, though mostly obscure part with regards to the so-called encounter between European and indigenous peoples in the Americas. As the story goes, Christopher Columbus came to Salamanca to consult with the scholars here about the possibility of reaching India by sailing west instead of east, thereby avoiding the circumnavigation of Africa. After getting their green light for this audacious idea, Columbus set sail from Palos de la Frontera in August 1492. 2 months later, Columbus stumbled into an unexpected continent that he mistook for India, a blunder that meant a change of era in the West, a cultural paradigm shift, the hegemony of modern Eurocentrism. Shortly after, in view of the excesses of imperial expansion and colonization, the 16th century Iberian scholastic theologians and jurists, known as the School of Salamanca, reflected on the need to reconsider power relations between the European and indigenous nations. Countering the predominant idea in Europe that indigenous people of the Americas had no rights, they embraced Francisco de Vitoria's view that given that all humans share the same nature, they also share the same rights to life and liberty. Consequently, they propounded the so-called Law of Peoples, which is considered the forerunner of modern international law and human rights, and defended that indigenous people were free people by nature, with legitimate property rights. Therefore, they used the natural laws principle that human rights reside in the individual to question the tenets of colonization in the Americas. So, dear Katherena Vermette, I believe that your presence here today helps to continue this university's mission, this engagement over the centuries to align knowledge and ethics, equity, freedom, and justice. So thank you so much for accompanying us today and for your willingness to engage in conversation today. I will shut up now. And maybe you'd like to start this conversation by discussing your call to write. Where does your writing come from?
First of all, thank you. I am not good with technology, so you might have to do that a couple times. Thank you. That is a very tall order to continue on this very weighted history. But thank you for that introduction to this place, and thank you for the very warm welcome. Part of my protocols as an Indigenous person, when we go someplace, we must introduce ourselves in a traditional way. So I'm going to, if you will indulge me, I will add yet another language to this day and introduce myself in Anishinaabemowin. So I say Buju, Tanse, Tanshi, Jikwanakwaduk, Nadishnakas, Zangigaboik, Mede Nadishnakas, Rivière Rouge, Winnipeg, Nadunjaba, Magisi, Nadonam, Marcy, Chimigwech. Thank you. So that was a blending of, actually I threw in a couple words in Michif there. Michif is my people's language, and Anishinaabemowin is my ceremonial language and the language of my spiritual teachers. What I did there is I introduced my spiritual names, which are the names that, you know, the ancestors know me by, and also introduced my clan, which is the Eagle Clan, and also brought in some of that language that was so painstakingly attempted to be eradicated by, you know, some of the people that hung out here. So happy to bring it forward and, you know, let your ancestors know that they weren't quite successful in that. Yeah.
Exactly. Well, thank you.
Thank you. You had a question in there. I completely lost that.
Yes. The question was about the source of your writing.
The source of my writing. I love that question. I think the source of my writing, and I've been thinking a lot, and my talk tomorrow is about poetry and as life story, so I've been thinking a lot about poetry as my own life story. In a lot of ways, I write in many different genres, and in a lot of ways, my novels feel like an imagination, and my poetry feels like more of a memoir. That's how I approach it. But it both take on two different forms, and one is my own individual stuff. You know, this constant need we have to assert ourselves as humans, and tell our stories, and maybe say, I'm here too, and this is what is going on with me. And I look at it as this constant conversation that we have amongst writers, amongst authors, but also amongst all of us. And my work is my contribution to that, but also my work is forever a celebration of community and the community I come from, which I always feel like, I mean, I'm such an introvert, and I really just hang out with my dog all day. So I say, I love my community, but I never see them. We never hang out, we sometimes message. But it's really just a celebration of where I come from and who I come from. And as Indigenous people, and in North America, as I introduced you, the other thing I mentioned, not only with my name, what I forgot was also where I'm from. The idea being, you know me by knowing where I come from, because where I come from literally built me. So that's where my stories always stem from, and where I start and where I always end up eventually.
Right, so I don't know if I'm switching on here. So location is very important. You situate yourself in a very specific place, and that's where your inspiration comes from, and also your concerns, right? Mm-hmm. What you are interested in talking about, in conversing about. But since we are in a faculty of translation, and also with an international audience, I'd like to ask you about your views on translation. It seems to me that even if your writing is so deeply grounded in specific history, specific place, the experience and the land of the Métis Nation, and has a very particular reception in Canada too, it definitely deals with concerns and feelings and emotions that can be considered universal. You know, for lack of a better term. So it goes beyond whatever political and cultural boundaries and it trespasses the particularities of place and language. So translations help, right, to extend the reach of literary works to very diverse audiences. And both your poetry and your prose have been translated into various languages. Your books of poetry, Northern Songs and River Woman, have been published in French as Ballade d'amour du Nord-End and Femme Rivière. And the same as your novels, The Break and The Strangers, translated, as I said before, as Ligne Brisée. I'm also curious about Les Femmes du Nord-End, because this is the same thing. Different title for the same novel?
That is the France French version.
Oh,
so for some,
Quebec has a different...
Quebec and France, they got their own little turf war going on.
Oh, right.
And when it comes to books, many... Quebec, how I was told is that Quebec likes to have Canadian books and books translated in Quebec, in Quebecois, but it is French. And then in France, they wanted a completely different version because they, of course, do not regard Quebec French as their French. So it's funny, we have two completely translated, but those two translators, Hélène Fournier in France and, totally forgot her name, in Quebec. Those were the translators I worked most closely with. There's a Spanish version I had no say in. There's other languages that I never had any interaction with the translators. But the two in French, they had the questions. They were so detail-oriented to get everything exactly right, which I appreciated.
Right. You know. So this is partially answering my question because, I know there's another a translation of The Strangers into French, Les Femmes Stranger.
Oui.
The Break has also appeared in German.
Yep.
I'm not going to pronounce that in German. There are German people here. And in Spanish, the title is Un lugar sin nombre, a place without a name, which is wrong because there was a name, The Break. Right?
It was, and also my issue with that, like I had and this was just me, getting my fisticuffs on, and because I had a problem with that title, because the whole idea of a place with no name, the whole idea of terra nullius is something that has been imposed on North America and also Australia as a means of, being able to take over the land, being able to say that there were no people here, this was an empty place. So it was actually, colonial policy.
Right,
so I didn't want my book called that. It felt.
Well, the colonial overtones are evidently
there. The colonial
there,
overtones are kind of everywhere, unfortunately.
Okay. So I was going to ask you about your role in the whole process of translation, but as you've explained, it's very varied. It's very different. You had a close relation with the translators into French, but not with the rest of them.
With my Quebecois translators of the poetry and the novels, we also had a common language, I guess, because we were from Canada, and they had one of my translators who translated La Femme Rivière, the second book of poetry. She was Acadian. So Acadian are kind of a distant cousin of the Michif. We're kind of under the Creole umbrella. So there was a lot of things that I didn't have to explain to her, particularly about language and Michif and kind of where my people come from. But the other two, and then the dude that did North End Love Songs, he was an indigenous. He was Haudenosaunee from Quebec City. So there was some other things that we didn't have to translate for that. Very different places, but there's some solidarity there. But that was very different than any translators I've worked with outside of Canada, in Germany and in France, because there's so many questions that I don't even consider that I have to answer, because they're not only specific to my community and my nation, my indigenous nation, but also very specific to Canada and the systems that are surrounding us.
Right. Yeah. So a little bit of cultural background that should.
And you don't notice that, because my concern is specificity. My concern is getting the story right. And I really push against having to explain all the time, right? Because it is always this notion of, it's always on the onus on the other to constantly explain where they're coming from. So I kind of want to just let the story stand on its own as much as possible. But there is inevitable explanation that has to happen just to get by.
You're very eclectic in terms of genre use, right? Your practice covers from poetry to narrative, the graphic novel, children's book, film, documentary. So what is it that each of these forms provides you with? What is it that they allow you to do or to explore that others don't? I'm sorry about this because I didn't want to move to the following slide. But
I like this slide. I like this.
Yes, we'll get to that.
Okay, we're going to totally get to that. And I was just saying outside that I tend to work wherever the story tells me to, which is a very poetic way of saying I just kind of wander around and end up with where I end up. I do feel like I write in poetry, and I do make the argument that everything I write is actually poetry. Mm-hmm. It just kind of comes into different forms. Mm-hmm. And, one day a grad student will write that paper and figure out exactly how I do that, because I don't know. But it is, I do think that fiction kind of comes out of, like, it feels like this poetic point where I really look at image and very deeply and meaning into something very, very small. And like a scene in a novel really is something very specific and very small. And that's kind of where I tend to write in very close thirds, if not first persons. I want to be right in there as much as possible. So in a sense, that does all feel like poetry to me. Children's books especially. Children's books is all poetry. Because it's you're finding a cadence, and you're getting into a melody. Even if I don't rhyme, I cannot rhyme to save my life. But in children's books, you still have this kind of dance that you kind of do with the lines. And in film and graphic novel, that's all images. That's all like you're really just putting things together, just like you would a poem. So.
And at the same time, even your poetry is also a narrative. Yeah. It's not like, taking an image and just dealing with it. There's usually a story there, so it's like this blend, right? Like your poetry is very embedded in your narrative, but it's also the other way around.
It's true. That's true. A lot of my poetry, the way I ended up writing it, the oral tradition of Indigenous storytelling is very similar to what a lot of Indigenous poetry is now, and it's exactly that. It's just it's the story. It's telling the story and using images and metaphors, whatever, to really grind the meaning. So that it becomes memorable, because we were an oral people. Everyone was speaking. We were talking before I came in. Everyone was speaking all these many languages and coming from all these different places, and then sharing their stories. And they did that by and they talked for a long time, and they kept interest, hopefully, by pulling in all of these images and all of these different things, and making these poems that were also stories. So the line has already been blurred there for generations of storytellers before me.
Just following the tradition.
Just following the trend.
So talking about children's book, your first career was as a kindergarten teacher.
Wow, you dug deep.
In Winnipeg, right?
Yep.
So I suppose this experience has influenced your interest, right, in writing children's books and also for young adults. So maybe you can expound a little bit on that.
For sure. Well, the first children's books I wrote, the 7 teaching stories, that was from my time. I worked as a kindergarten teacher in a program called Indigenous Head Start, which was a complementary program for kindergarten and nursery age, preschool age kids who were either in the foster care system, and many children are in the foster care system. Lots of reasons for that. But also just to give a bit of a head start, just supplementary educational program, but also a traditional program and also a spiritual program. So one of the things we studied, as much as you study with kindergartners, is the 7 teachings. So really exploring the 7 teachings, it's a really watered down children's version of a very, very ancient, complicated set of philosophies, which basically, boils down to these 7 teachings, and each one of those 7 teachings has an animal teacher, as you will, and each one of those lessons are prolific, like wisdom and love, you can talk about that forever. They're kind of guiding principles, So in that, I wanted to make a story. For kids, it was all inspired by my students. It was all for my students. It was really for them to see themselves and how we were teaching them, how they were teaching me that they were learning these things, these very, very heighty concepts.
And these are, even though they are, as we were saying before, universal concepts, but these 7 teachings come from the Anishinaabe culture.
Yeah.
So how do you deal with that? Because you say, I come from the Métis cultural background. This is a different culture.
It's different, and we're the Michif and the Anishinaabe and the Innu or Cree all come from around the place where I come from, Winnipeg, Red River area. And they are very different and very distinct in their own nations, and they're also very similar and connected to each other. The lines between, again, not getting into the big sordid history, you can look it up online, and some of it is even accurate online. But the lines around Michifness were kind of arbitrarily drawn by government, whereas previous to when we had to all be put into boxes, the lines between us were very blurry. And that happened wherever Indigenous nations gathered, because everyone intermarried and everyone, and everyone was literally cousins with one another. So the lines between us were very different. So for me, and that's very specific to my place. The histories of Indigenous contact with one another is very different and specific to every place. So we were connected to each other where I was. So all of my traditional teachers have been either Cree, Anishinaabe, or Michif. So the teachings, I wrote them in Anishinaabe-Moan because my teachers were Anishinaabe-Moan, and that's who I took the names from and the knowledges from, and they're very, very specific to that kind of Western Anishinaabe or Ojibwe. But it is also connected to Michif. It's not connected to Michif.
All right.
Yeah, which just complicates everything.
Well, but this emphasis on interconnection is there, and it's very much reclaimed by Indigenous peoples from North America all over, right? So
it is, and it's so very different in every place. And I try again. I come back to that idea of the specific is the universal, but that's a connection that's very specific to Winnipeg, to my place, to Red River. And the Indigenous nations across North America and Canada are as diverse as the nations across Europe, if not more so. There's differences between our languages from one coast to the other that are as different as English to Cantonese. There's so much variety in all of those places.
It seems to me that imagery and metaphor are consistently central elements in both your poetry and your prose. So I wonder whether you have a methodology that you apply, you know, when you say, okay, I'm going to write a novel, and this is how I'm going to do it. Or you sit there and wait for the inspiration and the characters to descend.
That's exactly how it
you.
happens.
Yeah?
Yep, that's it. I just sit there and wait for the inspiration to come up. But no, I don't have any rhyme or reason. When I think, and when I teach writing, I tend to teach towards that, you know, I think you have to begin with a lot of openness. Mm-hmm. And you just kind of have to, you do. I mean, it does, you know, and some writers, I always think of Richard Wagamese when people go like this, because Richard Wagamese is a prolific writer.
They know
Oh,
Richard
you know
Wagamese
Richard Wagamese? Okay.
He was Indian Horse. Yeah.
He was a wonderful, beautiful human. But he would always talk about how he would go out into the bush, the spirits would talk to him, and then he'd go home and write. And then he made this, like, you know, then he would also say things like, I never edit, I never do. However it's presented to me by the ancestors, that's how I write it. And I call a little bullshit on that. I'm sure there was like some, you know, grammar correction here and there. And that, or at least that's not how it happens for me at all. I do think them as gifts. Another great writer, Richard Van Camp, if you know Richard Van Camp. Mm-hmm. He's a wonderful writer, dog writer from up north. He talks about the stories being gifts. And I do think we're gifts. I do think stories and poems kind of gift themselves. But it's our job as writers to then polish them and make them into something that operates on this plane. You know, so inspiration, I believe in being open to that inspiration, but then then after that comes the craft, and you work it into something that you want it to be.
But so you sit down to write whatever comes to you, and it is after that you decide this is going to be a poem and not a story or a novel, or how does it work?
Well, I think, okay, I always try to not sound so hoity-toity, hippy-dippy when I say these things, but there is a bit of hoity-toity, hippy-dippy. I do think poems are poems, you know, and poets know this, right? A poem was like, I'm a poet, not so violent, hopefully, but a poem is a poem, and a poem knows and has a whole, and it will tell you what its rules are, whether you're operating in a tradition or whether you're using free verse. A poem will kind of present itself with its rules, and you work a poem until you find it, and you polish it like a gemstone until it is itself. For me, stories are more, I hear stories in voices, because I speak so, or I write so closely. Maybe they speak to me closely to voice. Mostly first person. A lot of my stories start in first person, almost like it feels almost like I'm taking dictation in a way. That's where it starts, right? And then it's not always legible. It's not always good. It's just kind of it's something, and then I take it and try to make it into something, you know, from there. But it feels like a voice that isn't mine, and that's kind of how I know it's a story rather than a poem.
So a poem is more autobiographical, it's more of your voice, and story is stories of somebody else.
Somebody else, yeah. They have tons of me in them, you know. I think all writers do that. I think we all just write ourselves over and over again, whether we want to or not. But for me, that's how I do it. I approach poetry much more autobiographically. While also saying that I'll never write a memoir. I go on record, I'll never write a memoir. I don't want to write, I've lived that life, I don't need to write it, but I write it all the time.
You also write primarily about inner city Métis and Indigenous women. And nevertheless, men emerge in your writing as absolutely central to the community building, to these women's lives. So I'm intrigued by the way that you explore masculinities in your novels, mostly through the eyes of women, which gives them a very interesting perspective. You create, I think, a counter-narrative, right, to the hegemonic, masculinist, patriarchal narratives. So how do you tackle the creation of male characters? Some of them are really toxic characters. Some of them are very benign, very good people, who are really necessary for the community to heal and to go on working. So do you try to find a balance there, or?
I don't know if I achieve a balance, even if I try. And thank you for saying that my male characters are central, because so often, particularly from the break, I get a lot of man-hating label, which I am not, I swear. But it is a women-centric book. And I do think, and The Strangers also is women-centric, and The Circle is me maybe trying for more of that balance. Not deliberately, just because it felt like the story it was a circle of voices, so it needed a more diversity of the voices. I do have lots of toxic characters. I love toxic characters. Male, female, non-binary.
Noticed.
I love them. I love playing with bitterness and how people. I'm forever fascinated by trauma, which is not fun, and how it lives in your body and your mind and your spirit, and how some people can go through the exact same thing and turn out fine, and other people are absolutely wrecked by it. It's like I think of persons as, I'm a huge therapy nerd, and I think of persons I think of characters, not people. I don't do this to people, I swear. But I think of characters as like these building blocks of different things, and they make a pattern of who these people are. And sometimes it's things that happen to them, and sometimes it's a personality that came out of something amazing that happened to them, and sometimes it's something devastating that happened to them. I mean, we're all built up of all of these many things, and I think it's fascinating how people can seem exactly the same, but have a completely different block building inside of them. The first male character, I never wrote a male character until I wrote Tommy from The Break. He was the last character I wrote in that book. He, I think, is, oh, hi. That's the kind of thing I do when I deal with technology, so don't worry. You'll notice tomorrow I don't deal with any technology whatsoever, because I will just mess it up. But Tommy was my challenge to that book that was all women voices. I did want to speak to, and the Break and North End Love Songs being my first work, I did want to speak very specifically about people like me. I do believe in specificity, as I said. I do believe in writing from where you're from, as I've said. I also think it's our duty as writers to write what we know, however we want to interpret that. It doesn't have to necessarily be a biography or autobiography or something very, like, exactly how you are. It can be fantasy, it can be sci-fi, but it comes from your source. I don't believe in co-opting other voices and trying to be something so different from you. And for me, for a long time, that was maleness, because I, am not walking around on this plane as a male person. I do think in that conversation, though, I do think there's a very important element of power, and how we, so as marginalized folks, we understand the majority. We understand the mainstream. We are taught to understand the mainstream. We're constantly working toward and translating through those who have oppressed us. So for me to write a white person is very different than a white person writing an Indigenous person, because I think that power relationship is so integral with how we're interpreting each other. So that's kind of how I first approached writing a guy. I also wanted to challenge myself. I also realized that this book, The Break, All Women Voices, that cover, you know, the fierce woman, I knew that no man would ever pick up this book. It looked scary, it was scary, so I really wanted kind of Tommy as like this softness to that. And it was that challenge to me, and at first I thought it was going to be that power dynamic. And it was a total lesson to me, and this is like, writers, we give these lessons to ourselves all the time. So I thought I was gonna write him as someone who had power over me and power over these women. But immediately as I wrote him as my brothers and my cousins and my friends, and he wasn't a cop, he was a Michif boy, you know, who in the end goes and doesn't know what to do and goes and asks his mom what to do, which is, you know, kind of everything you need to know about Indigenous masculinity.
Also a little bit alienated, right, from the community, because he's hiding his identity as a Métis person in order to fit, I guess. But then to get the police job, he needs to come out. Right?
Which is, you know, as in many of our communities, policing is the other, the outsider that oppresses the community, so he had to become the
there's this paradox.
So he does these back and forth, which I love living in those identity bubbles and those like conundrums, and I thought it was such an interesting way to explore all of those things of how he could be. And for me, it was a total lesson in realizing how similar he was to me. You know, despite all of those things that I looked at as differences.
Yeah. I'm fascinated by your skill to create multifaceted characters, and Tommy is, of course, one of them.
Tommy is wonderful. I like Tommy.
Yeah.
Well,
not just really. Multiple perspectives. There are so many characters. Well, the family trees we'll be talking about in a minute fit in this pattern, right? But your characters appear as very complex and very nuanced. And that's always, you know, something we have to thank authors for, because you are never preachy. It's up to the reader to make up, you know, their own conclusions and ideas about what is going on and how the different characters are. This symposium is titled Literary Genealogies in the Feminine in a World in Crisis. And genealogies is something that you are very keen on. And here comes
the genealogies.
The wonderful family trees that you gift us with. The first family tree is for The Break. The second one here is for The Strangers. And the third one is for The Circle. So my question is, I see an evolution here, right? From family trees, which I will ask you, what do they mean to you, apart from the evident meaning of them, to this last novel, the third novel, and this relational circle. We don't have a family tree any longer. We have all these bubbles.
Bubbles, so effervescent. Well, first of all, backstory is that I'm obsessed with genealogies. All Michif people are. In order to get your card, you know, okay. So I don't know how much I have to explain about
Yeah,
this.
maybe you
Yeah.
could explain
So
something
in order
about
to
that.
get Michif cards or status cards to kind of claim your Indigenous citizenship into your nation, not your Indigenous nation, you have to go through this process of verifying who you are. So one of the things you have to do is provide a genealogy. So you have to provide a genealogy about 5 to 6 generations back, proving your connection, to your community. So that's something that all us Michif people have in droves because we were very well documented by the church. It was something that happened as soon as the church came to Red River in 1840s. Our marriages, our coming and going in marriages were just documented. And it was something that was used kind of as, for baptisms and conversions and whatnot. But it was also something used to track our demise in order to, and all Indigenous persons, it was kind of started to track how we were dying because the goal was to have us all die off. And in a couple generations later, it was really to claim our land and our land base and to be able to take our land base from us and give it to incoming settlers. So we were kept track of. And that's something that we've now reclaimed in this place of gaining citizenship and reclaiming citizenship for those who have lost it. Because several people, for many, many reasons, have lost their citizenship through, a whole bunch of genocidal policy reasons. So that they can now provide a genealogy and they can now reconnect to a community that they were forcibly, in many cases, forcibly taken from. So we all have these genealogies. We all love these genealogies. We use them to track how we're related to one another and also all our famous people. Our big famous people being Louis Riel. So any Michif person anywhere will tell you how they're related to Louis Riel. He was my great-great-grandfather's nephew by marriage.
Wow.
And also Gabriel Dumont, the other, famous Michif guy, he was my great-great-great-uncle's adopted through ceremony uncle. Totally claim. And that uncle also died at Batoche, which was our last great battle. So we love these things, or I love these things, and I, know many Michif people love. I'm sure not everybody. Some people, like other things, I'm sure, but it's something that, we have a lot of genealogy nerds in the ranks. So when I wanted to, that was a very long introduction. When I wanted to write a story and a novel, originally it was a collection of short stories, and I loosely connected and I kind of interwoven it closer and closer together to make a novel. I did want multiple characters. I love multiple point of view novels. I knew I wanted to do that from the start. Polyphonic is what they're called. But in order to do, I wanted to talk about a family tree. I wanted to pick out different generations of the family tree, and I wanted to include a genealogy. I also wanted to include a map, but the map didn't make sense, and my editor didn't think. I'm also a map nerd, total other conversation. But so I did want to start.
I have the map here. If you want maps.
Well, see, these are so that is Red River up in the top there, and the windy things are the rivers. So this first one going north to south is Red River, and this other one going west is the Assiniboine. And right at the juncture there, right kind of south of St. Boniface. Oh, there's another one there. So right at, where is it? It's right at Fort Rouge there. The Fort Rouge, and I'm trying to figure it out. Yeah,
this
right
is
there.
St. Boniface.
Yeah,
this is the north end.
that's a little, where is it? Because that's a little weirded. Anyway, the juncture is the Forks, which is an ancient meeting place for thousands of years. And that other squiggly line is the Seine River. So I can also tell you that my family's original land was in it would be in that south end portion. Probably at one of the, in the last orange parts by one of those bends here. So the land that was taken from my family in 1870, yeah, I know, I dug deep, is from that was that lot along the river. And now there's, about 100 of us, hundreds of us actually, because, we were also Catholic, so the families were huge, as Catholic families are. So it's not that it's my land, it's like hundreds of our Vermette descendants' land, but it's my land. Just kidding. That's all. So genealogies, I wanted to include the genealogy. So for the break, it was the Traverse family. And for the strangers, it was the Stranger family. So it was both of their genealogies. And then for the Circle, so the Circle is a different kind of book. It's kind of like a short story collection, kind of like a interconnected novel. Every chapter is a different voice. But it's both these two families. I keep going here, but you can't see that. It's both these two families kind of together. So I wanted to say how we're, and we're not just related by blood. We're not just related by genealogy. So I wanted to kind of put them together in this little effervescent bundle here. And that's kind of how, so everybody's kind of related to each other. You have the strangers up here and you have the traverses up here. But then you also have all these other people who are connected, and they're connected to one another. So the short answer, this is not a short answer, is that one is those two together.
Okay, so a real emphasis on interconnection,
Very much.
not just among characters, but here among the three books, right? You're just condensing in the last one the kinships and interconnections created in the two former books. So that's also very characteristic of indigenous culture, right? The emphasis on this interconnectivity, and not just with people, but with the land, with
all
the
things.
non-human, right? With all beings.
Relatives is often
Exactly.
the word.
All our relatives.
All our relatives. And this actually, genealogies and stuff is actually an indigenous literary tradition. So folks like Richard Van Camp often use interconnected stories similar to this. Louise Erdrich often uses a genealogy, especially in her earlier novels, which were all connected. This is not new,
Exactly.
And that's another wonderful grad student thesis that someone should write about all the use of genealogy and why we do this.
Here you have an idea.
All about the papers.
And maybe I can wrap up with just one more question regarding your trigger warnings.
Okay.
Because I'm going to read the two trigger warnings that appear at the beginning of The Break and The Strangers. In The Break, in the very first pages, we have this trigger warning. This book is about recovering and healing from violence. Contains scenes of sexual and physical violence and depictions of vicarious trauma. We are very used to that. We woke up today to the news that one more woman and her two twin children had been killed by their father. And this is, going on, and it's almost an everyday story on the news. So you open the novel with this, and then with The Strangers, you have also a trigger warning. This book is about coping within the systems that have been imposed on us. So there are plenty of triggers for those whose lives have been traumatically affected by them. These include depictions of child apprehension, solitary incarceration, suicide ideation, some drug use, and some physical violence. It's not just about that, hey? And I do try to cram as much love and hope in between as possible. So it seems to me that these warnings denote from the start a concern with the writer's responsibility and with the writer's accountability, right, to the readers and the communities the books speak to. So maybe you could also explain your take on this. And of course, I'm fascinated by the way you are guiding readers about don't dismay. This is not just about portraying violence and trauma. This is about hope. This is about healing, right? So.
And the funny addition to that is that in the circle, I completely neglected to make a trigger warning. And I don't think, for me, the circle is not nearly as difficult as the break and the strangers. I purposely lightened it, but not that I really lightened it all the way. It's still a novel, and a lot of stuff happens. But yeah, I did, when I put out the break, it was really hard for me to put out the break. It took me years to write it because I did feel the burden of that responsibility of how to portray what I wanted to portray correctly. I wanted to talk about these legacies that we carry, but I wanted to talk about them in the ways of how we overcome, for lack of a better word, how we rely on each other, how our aunties and grandmothers and mothers and friends really help us through all of that. I wanted it to be about strength, but in doing that, I had to talk about what they were, recovering from, and how these things, had affected them. How someone like Stella, who's really just sitting in her house the whole time, is just like going through this spiral of all of the things that haven't even happened to her. It's just things that have happened to people around her, but we're still affected by them, right? But I also wanted to talk about how, but I didn't want it to stay there, so often, or too often maybe in the past. I don't think we do that now. I think we've gotten much better at looking toward strength and joy and laughter and happiness, and how we can exist in these worlds and still also exist in this joy and this beauty. So for me, it took a lot of years to figure out how to do that properly, and I was very conscious of what was in the book and what I had to write. I was very conscious in not exploiting what happened in the book whenever everything was, had potential to be exploitative. I got in and out as fast as I could. I made sure there was a lot of care around. So anytime there's something traumatic that happens in the break, I hope it's all dramatic, there's usually some tea drinking or anti-laughter happens after that. I did that really deliberately. I actually edited out aside, there's a lot of tea drinking in the break, because if you go through and, when you're going through stuff, there's a lot of, passing of hot beverages, right? We're soothing each other. I actually edited out a couple incidents of tea drinking, because there was a lot of tea drinking. But so I was very careful with that, and in that I wanted to include a trigger warning. And I was on the fence about the trigger warning until my editor said, my publisher, I approached her with this idea of the trigger warning, and she said, well, we just don't do that in Canadian literature. And I'm like, well, now I have to do it. So I really wanted to write it. I didn't want it to be just a list of all the bad things that were in it. I was a little more deliberate with that with the strangers, because I wanted to talk about, it's not just about that, but I do believe in the idea of warning people what they're getting into. And maybe I forgot about it in the circle, because I figure anyone who's picking up my books at this point knows what to expect.
Okay. Well, I guess that we've run out of time. I can't get enough of it, but we'll have a second chance to address your work tomorrow and to listen to you reading from your poetry.
Oh, for sure.
And therefore, this is not a goodbye.
It's not goodbye.
This is a see you tomorrow. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
So those of you who have books to sign or who want to, approach Katherena, Vermette with questions, come tomorrow at 11, okay? Because we don't have time today. I'm sorry about that.